And now, in a very nice complementary sense, I would like to introduce AV Goutham to you. So please bear with me while I do this. AV is going to ask a pertinent question now about how we train our students and what exactly are we training our students to become. AV Goutham is APPA certified and PPAI certified. That's the Philosophical Practice Association of India, formed during the pandemic. He has over 20 years of cross-disciplinary experience across science, philosophy, and media. AV holds an MA in philosophy and has multiple B.Scs in physics, photography, and audiovisual production. He's a visiting scholar at Fergusson College in Pune. He's a guest lecturer for other events, including PPAI, co-founder and director of WiseOne HelpSelf Wellness, LLP, an ecosystem offering psychological and philosophical counseling to a global clientele. He's documented over 250 hours of counseling sessions. His research is published in peer-reviewed journals, including our own. And as an author and filmmaker, his background also includes co-writing a feature film screenplay preserved for research by the Academy of Motion Picture Arts and Sciences. And he's going to talk to us about what exactly are we training students to become. Rebuilding an undergraduate course in philosophical practice. That's certainly relevant for a lot of us who are reaching out in response to student demands for this now. It's a good sign, is it not, that our movement has grown and proliferated to the extent that undergraduates now see philosophical practice as an actual career path. This was not the case 30 years ago, but it is the case today. So, welcome, AV. Let me co host you, and if you have slides to share, you may please do so. And thank you
Yeah.
so much for contributing to today's meeting.
Yes. Hello. And thank you, Lou.
Uh,
My audio is clear?
Yes, we can hear you.
Yes. Thank you. I presented a paper 2 years ago, dialogical metaposition in the symbolism of Bhagavad Gita with you. And I'm glad to tell you that it was that paper which led me to Fergusson College. They took me seriously and gave me the opportunity to, do these lectures. Okay. So this paper is about what happened from there onwards and what I discovered in the process. So I'll start with this. So for its foundational decades, the global movement of philosophical practice defined itself negatively. It was not psychotherapy. While this boundary setting successfully established the field as a distinct modality of ethical and existential deliberation, the discipline has long since moved beyond this defensive stance. Today, the true frontier of philosophical practice is no longer external justification, but internal validity, determining whether the fluid, dialogical, and improvisational essence of the discipline can actually be formally taught without destroying its core. This challenge confronts what David McConney terms the university's monopoly on training. The modern academy frequently approaches philosophy through an objectivist conception of learning, where rigid methodologies treat students as passive recipients of theoretical knowledge. When viewed through Martin Buber's phenomenological framework, traditional academic structures operate within an I-it paradigm of objective observation. The academic drive to comprehend, compare, and analyze inherently forces the student to relate to the client as an object, which fundamentally complicates the intersubjective I-you encounter necessary for genuine dialogical praxis. To navigate these structural limitations, we initiated a 2-year empirical research program at Fergusson College. Catalyzed by India's National Education Policy or NEP 2020, which mandated a shift towards experiential, learner-centered, and inquiry-driven frameworks, we secured the required institutional affordance to host a rigorous undergraduate program. We were driven by a single practical question, which is the title of this paper. What would undergraduate philosophy education look like if philosophical practice, not only theory, shaped its design? So, to test the teachability of the dialogical attitude, the phase one of the curriculum was initiated. It set aside standard syllabus delivery. Instead, it unfolded as a systematic exploration, mapping the cohort's epistemic baseline to reveal what capacities the foundational class possessed and what the discipline actually needed to impart. To map this baseline, the curriculum confronted the cohort with culturally situated dilemmas. For example, they were presented with the real world tension of an apartment manager caught between an illicit desire and the deeply internalized moral obligation of what we call ekapatnivrata, or the cultural oath of singular devotion to one's wife. Okay, so this is the dilemma when they were presented. It was a real case. My wife, who is a psychologist, had that case. So we discussed about that. So this provocation tested their capacity to extract underlying philosophical friction from a narrative. So an analysis of the initial case stories revealed a strong intellectual baseline. So I say case stories because they were inspired from their own life experiences or their peers' experiences. We basically spoke about the life event, extracted the possible life issues according to them, and saw the philosophical tension in it and how we dialogically approach that subject. So these were called case stories. They were serious, but not like the real life case stories. So between 2023 and 25 academic cycles, we had 50 case stories coming from the students. So in case 24, for instance, the student successfully demonstrated the conceptual rigor required to map high-level philosophical tensions, accurately extracting the conflict of value versus practicality from a corporate job dilemma without collapsing into psychological reductionism. So this indicated that the students possessed the intellectual capacity to identify philosophical tensions, philosophical issues. However, observing the cohort as a whole exposed a severe methodological problem. Despite this established baseline, the students consistently drifted toward motivational or self-help discourse, as we shall see. So, evaluating this preparation required navigating the university's strict administrative parameters, which mandated continuous and end of semester evaluations. So this structure was complicated by a significant modern methodological constraint, the proliferation of generative AI. So because written case stories could be artificially, created to simulate conceptual depth, document submissions alone were found insufficient for, confirming their actual dialogical competence and growth. So consequently, the evaluative process fused these constraints by placing a significant weight of assessment on the live presentations of the case stories and the ensuing classroom discussions, which were basically unscripted but based on their written case stories. It was strictly within these live dialogical exchanges that where students were required to spontaneously articulate their reasoning. So this is where their raw conversational reflexes became very much observable. So the primary data from these live evaluations exposed the instrumental trap of procedural methodologies. Within contemporary philosophy education, there is a highly respected pedagogical consensus that treats the discipline as a transferable toolkit for thinking. In the paper I'm going to submit, I have given the proper citations for this, equipping students with discrete tools such as conceptual exploration and logical inference. While this toolkit paradigm is highly effective for general education, the findings from this cohort demonstrated that applying it directly to the lived intersubjective environment of philosophical practice fundamentally triggers a prescriptive reflex. So this prescriptive reflex was systemic among the students, occurring not in spite of, but because of their rigorous preparation with analytical tools. So in case 14, for instance, despite accurately applying Sartre's view of alienation to his client's relational disillusionment, the student's deeply socialized conversational reflex caused him to default to advice giving. He documented that his client was encouraged to practice detachment and advised to be kind. Okay, in case 34, the student systematically deployed complex epistemological frameworks utilizing, we used Indian philosophy here, pramana mapping, mapping the pramana to identify the valid source of the client's knowledge, alongside Aristotelian ethics. Yet the evaluation rubric recorded a significant methodological limitation. So I noted, the evaluator noted that the client's voice is subordinated to philosophical categories. I think in the previous paper this was spoken. So it was subordinated to philosophical categories rather than guiding the inquiry. So by treating the philosophical traditions as a procedural toolkit, this student collapsed genuine inquiry into a technical diagnostic procedure. So this limitation was paralleled in case 45. And this was the brightest student in the previous batch, according to me. He was very argumentative. So tasked with examining a case story concerning recurrent marital infidelity, the student overlaid the client's lived experience with predetermined academic constructs. So the evaluator's feedback noted that the deployed philosophical references feel imported, not discovered through dialogue, and that the counselor dominates with elegant phrasing. Okay, the approach exemplifies Anders Lindset's foundational warning: genuine philosophical practice fails when the practitioner lacks the discipline of epoch, immediately subordinating the client's expression to their previous knowledge. An overview of the cohort confirmed these were not isolated incidents. The students did not falter intellectually, they struggled relationally because the cohort instrumentalized the tools and subordinated the client's narrative to their own previous knowledge. They reflexively locked the philosophical encounter into a technical scientific paradigm. Operating within this paradigm reduces philosophy to an applicable theory, relying on diagnostic techniques, leading the students to inevitably assume a hierarchical expert position to solve their clients' dilemmas. So this is what I'm calling interventionist philosophy, interventionist fallacy in this paper. So now, evaluating this pedagogical outcome requires situating the cohort's behavior within established methodological critiques of philosophical counseling. So the documented interactions reveal a distinct regression into clinical diagnostic modalities, critiqued by Peter Rabe and Sergio Marinov. So Marinov vigorously attacks the medicalization of the human condition, explicitly condemning professionals who act as experts at reifying syndromes. By operationalizing their philosophical frameworks to diagnose their peers, the students regressed into this exact medicalized modality. Rabe strictly distinguishes philosophical practice from the clinical model by insisting on the removal of the hierarchical diagnostic dynamic, explicitly mandating that the practitioner must abdicate as an expert. So, further, the underlying imperative to resolve the client's distress demonstrates the interventionist problem-solving orientation explicitly cautioned against by Ron Laha and Slumik Schuster. So Schuster, I hope I'm pronouncing it right. Schuster warns against this psychotherapeutic urge to cure or normalize. In claiming an assumed mandate to fix the client, the cohort inadvertently abandoned the shared ground required for genuine philosophical inquiry. By wielding their philosophical frameworks as diagnostic instruments, they transferred the encounter from a mutual exploration of existential meaning into a mechanical transaction. So, this phenomenon, however, was not seen as a deficit of a conceptual proficiency. It was like, based on my experience, I should say that, but clear evidence of a structural limitation within the pedagogy itself. Viewed through Paulo Freire's critique of the banking concept of education, the exact diagnosis emerges. the traditional lecture format successfully deposited complex epistemological theory into the students, as evidenced by their rigorous written analysis. But a monological delivery system is structurally incapable of transmitting an improvisational conversational reflex, which is required for genuine philosophical practice. So Freire notes that the banking concept resists a dialogue, okay, relying on a vertical pattern of authority where the narrating subject issues communiques to listening objects. A monological delivery system cannot train a dialogical attitude. So, this pedagogical realization exposes a stark disciplinary reality. Teaching procedural methodologies inadvertently conditions students to act as amateur therapists, not philosophical practitioners. So, now to protect the integrity of the discipline and initiate a structural paradigm shift, the phase 3 of the curriculum systematically excise the language of diagnostic models, applied extensions, and interventionist methods. However, merely changing the syllabus on paper would not insulate the classroom from the cohort's deeply socialized prescriptive reflex. To destabilize their assumed authority before introducing new cognitive capacities, the students were confronted with the theme people or experts paradox. So by exposing the students, I exposed the students to some social media reels of ordinary individuals confidently dispensing life formulas. So the curriculum drew a sharp boundary between possessing a personal philosophy and engaging in the rigorous discipline of philosophical inquiry. So in this half an hour presentation, I'm not able to cover everything we did, but we brought in a guest, and there was a live demonstration of how a worldview translates into philosophy and philosophy into worldview. I have written it in that actual paper I'm submitting, but here we did these things. So by exposing the students, sorry, this is done. So this intervention actively dismantled their preconception that the role of a philosopher is to supply prepackaged solutions. So, in place of procedural training, the new pedagogy anchored itself entirely in the cultivation of four interrelated cognitive capacities, which are identifying underlying assumptions, clarifying conceptual tensions, tracing competing value commitments, and sustaining non directive dialogue. So, embedding these capacities in established philosophical traditions ensured they function not as external communicative soft skills, but as internal disciplines of self-regulation. So, drawing on Pyrie Hadot, we approach these capacities as sustained intellectual exercises designed to shape the practitioner's subjectivity. So, within the earlier methodology, the students frequently became entangled in the circumstantial details of their peers' narratives. To resolve this, the curriculum anchored the foundational capacities, which is identifying underlying assumptions and clarifying conceptual tensions in Hannah Arendt's conception of the internal dialogue of thinking. Okay, Arendt argues that the fundamental condition of human thought is not solitary computation, but an internal plurality. So for Arendt, thinking is the active, soundless, two-in-one dialogue that the mind carries on with itself. An activity she notes is out of order in ordinary living. So this does not occur naturally in the conversations. So in the context of a philosophical practice, equipping a student to identify an underlying assumption requires sustaining this exact Arendtian duality. So the practitioner must learn to simultaneously inhabit two cognitive spaces, actively listening to the interlocutor's lived narrative while maintaining a secondary internal inquiry that structurally separates explicit claims from unexamined presuppositions. So the practitioner is not correcting the interlocutor's logic, they are sustaining their own internal cognitive tension. So this rigorous internal reflection prevents the practitioner from yielding to the prescriptive reflex allowing the conceptual tensions of the dilemma to surface organically within the dialogical space. So the redesign similarly anchored the advanced capacities, that is the tracing competing value commitments and sustaining non-directive dialogue in a rigorous discipline of self-audit, drawing upon Michael Foucault's technologies of the self and Paul Ricoeur's oneness as another, oneself as another. Ricoeur establishes that human identity is a fluid, dynamic, narrative selfhood because because the human identity is fluid, rushing into a mechanical diagnostic resolution actively violates the nature of the subject. So sustaining non-directive stance requires the practitioner to hold a space of reflective uncertainty without rushing toward premature closure. So rather than diagnosing the interlocutor, this disciplined restraint redirects the inquiry inward. The practitioner must continuously evaluate their own normative impulses, interpretative prejudices, and urges to intervene. So Foucault defines technologies of the self as operations that allow individuals to effect operations on their own thoughts and conduct to transform themselves. So in the context of this curriculum, the technology is the deliberate, disciplined withholding of advice, forcing the practitioner to master their own conversational ego. By making the practitioner's own subjectivity the primary site of regulation, the curriculum ensures that the dialogical encounter remains an open philosophical exploration rather than a prescriptive transaction. So, as the curriculum shifted toward cultivating this internal subjectivity shaping capacities, mapping this intersubjective encounter against a discrete 100 mark rubric, which was the university criteria, presented a direct problem of measurement. So, because the work involves holding questions open, clarifying assumptions, and maintaining non-directive boundaries, these capacities operate together as a composite intellectual stance. So, forced evaluation distorts the practice itself. Students inevitably learn to perform rather than sustain inquiry. We were forcing them to do that rather. So, this distortion is fundamentally epistemological. As Walshiner and Kebel argue regarding dialogical self theory, attempting to evaluate a dynamic fluctuating subject using fixed unitary point-like descriptors constitutes a complete theoretical impasse. So this the discrete metric strips the student of what Louis Miranda terms the regenerative singularity, the spontaneous capacity to hold uncertainty and engage in authentic creation. So instead, the pressure of the rubric forces them into generative regularity, a state of predictable mechanical production designed solely to satisfy institutional parameters. So, because genuine philosophical practice does not merely deploy logic to solve problems, but shifts the practitioner's ontological position so that the problems are dissolved, the assessment metric must shift from isolated performance to ontological formation. This was the idea. So when subjected to immediate grading, a student's dialogue risks becoming what Warner Ferry terms formally correct, but materially deficient. Okay. So while the student might utilize the acquired philosophical frameworks to perfectly satisfy the structural criteria of a given rubric, their engagement remains materially deficient because their unexamined prescriptive reflex still relies on the false assumption that an interlocutor is a problem to be solved. So evaluating isolated performance prematurely judges this developmental baseline before the practitioner has had the chance to outgrow it. So to resolve this epistemological distortion, discrete scoring was replaced with a trajectory-based model, a trajectory-based assessment model. So that tracks the coherence and restraint with which a student inhabits the dialogical space across multiple sessions. So this architectural shift aligns directly with educational psychologists' call for dynamic ongoing assessments conducted over time. So by expanding the temporal window of evaluation, the course builds a kind of a protective buffer around the student's reflective development. So by allowing the student the freedom to navigate conceptual resistance prior to formal evaluation, the model reconciles two competing needs. It meets institutional assessment mandates while containing the immediate pressure to perform. So within this extended time frame, the assessment framework evaluates these four cognitive capacities cultivated during the classroom practice by structuring them into three observational parameters. Since the analytical demands of the identifying underlying assumptions, clarifying conceptual tensions, and tracing competing value commitments, these three operate simultaneously during an actual dialogical encounter. So the assessment model groups these first three capacities into a single observational parameter, which is conceptual clarification. So the movement from narrative surface to underlying assumptions and computing values. Furthermore, this sustaining non-directive dialogue represents the precise threshold where the therapeutic reflex is most often triggered. So the architecture bifurcates this fourth capacity into two distinct observational parameters. So boundary discipline, and that is the negative restraint from advisory or therapeutic impulses, and boundary discipline and reflective disposition. So the positive capacity to sustain uncertainty and resist premature closure. So these three parameters, and that is conceptual clarification, boundary discipline, and reflective disposition, constitute a dynamic philosophical attitude that cannot be evaluated in isolation. So therefore, the framework assesses the dominant pattern. I'm not really totally happy with this, but this is where it is right now. So therefore, the framework assesses the dominant pattern of a student's engagement across the successive sessions. So based on this cumulative observation, the instructor determines which of the four qualitative performance bands, exemplary, proficient, emerging, or misaligned, best reflects the coherence and restraint with which the student inhabits the dialogical space. So, translating these qualitative bands into the institutionally mandated numerical scores cannot be achieved by simply averaging these three observational parameters like we did in the previous batch. So, averaging assumes that the parameters function independently, implying that a student's high proficiency in conceptual clarification might mathematically compensate for a lapse in the prescriptive reflex. That is not possible. But if the prescriptive reflex takes over, the shared intersubjective space collapses. The encounter turns into a prescriptive monologue, making the student's conceptual proficiency irrelevant to the inquiry. So, for this reason, the evaluation relies on a firm holistic translation. If a student's engagement is misaligned with the non-directive boundary, their overall grade is strictly restricted to the emerging performance band. So, this limitation reflects the precise recognition that genuine philosophical inquiry ceases to exist the moment advice giving begins. So by assessing the dominant pattern of engagement rather than relying on the aggregation of the rubric scores, the evaluative system generates its numerical output while remaining faithful to the lived reality of the dialogue. So now this process-oriented framework is not a flawless resolution to the conflict between the university's demand for quantification and the discipline's demand for intersubjectivity. So these two paradigms seem fundamentally irreconcilable. So rather, the architecture operates as a highly calculated functional compromise. By evaluating the overall pattern of a student's reflective engagement, it translates philosophical praxis into the mandated numerical scores, ensuring that the discipline can survive within the university without sacrificing its phenomenological core. So this two-year pedagogical initiative at Fergusson College establishes that a student's unexamined, socialized, reflexes constitute the primary objective to teaching philosophical practice. The traditional academic model systematically conditions philosophers to view competence through a technical scientific paradigm. When confronted with lived dilemmas, students simply applied their newly acquired theoretical frameworks as diagnostic instruments. This instrumentalization collapsed the intersubjective encounter into a mechanical transaction aimed at solving the client's problem, thereby precluding genuine philosophical inquiry and causing the student to commit the interventionist fallacy. Consequently, achieving non-directive dialogue requires the disciplined suspension of the prescriptive reflex. Teaching philosophical practice is fundamentally a process of cognitive unlearning and subjectivity shaping. So, by grounding the practice in internal cognitive capacities rather than procedural methods, the curriculum demonstrates that philosophical competence demands the disciplined restraint required to sustain inquiry, that is superseding the urge to provide immediate solutions. So, the empirical reality established by this research is that teaching procedural methodologies inadvertently trains amateur therapists, as I said earlier. So, if philosophical practice is to be formally taught as a lived inquiry, the pedagogy must move beyond instrumental techniques and substantively focus on shaping the practitioner's internal cognitive capacities. So, to ensure the survival of the discipline within the formal academy, institutions must outgrow the traditional model of theoretical transfer and prioritize the rigorous process of ontological formation. So this is where we have reached, and whatever I have discussed, we have to apply in the classroom and see. So that said, I must turn the lens of critical inquiry back upon this very project. Hmm. So I have these questions and I don't know the answers to them all. First, this assessment paradox. So, by automatically capping a student's grade at the emerging band for advice giving, do we inadvertently establish a new fixed unitary descriptor, committing the very epistemological distortion we accused traditional rubrics of making? Hmm? Next is the phenomenological tension. So, we demand an intense ascetic level of internal self-regulation to cure the prescriptive reflex. So, but this, does this constraint, does this constant internalized self-audit, this relentless monitoring of one's own subjectivity, risk detaching the practitioner from the authentic spontaneous immediacy of Martin Buber's IU encounter? So then the temporal friction. So in relying on unscripted live performance to authenticate competence and evade generative AI work, do we impose a temporal immediacy that belongs to rhetoric rather than philosophy? Does the method of improvisation structurally penalize profound methodical thinkers where philosophical rigor demands slower contemplation? So and finally the institutional paradox. So if genuine philosophical practice requires dismantling the expert posture and embracing informed ignorance, is it fundamentally paradoxical to institutionalize this praxis within the modern university, an entity structurally designed to certify expertise and transfer theoretical knowledge? So I don't know about this. Perhaps this upcoming classroom implementations will yield some clarity, and it will require your feedback, critique, and involvement. So to improve this. Thank you so much.
Well, thank you very much, Gautam. That was very challenging. It's really interesting that you and Ang Lee both, independently, without collusion, have also focused on the uncertainty aspect of things. But I'm going to open the floor. We have about 10 minutes for questions. I would just want to make one small comment. I can't resist. I've worked with many undergraduates over the years in different capacities, be they philosophy clubs or actually cohorts of undergraduates who wanted exposure to philosophical practice. And I completely agree with your approach. I mean, we don't, to undergraduates particularly, I've never taught theories or methods of philosophical practice, only engaged in Socratic dialogue with them. And my reason is much simpler. It's just the idea is that when students study Plato in the traditional academy, they're spectators of a dialogue. They're not in the dialogue, they're spectating. When they participate in a Socratic dialogue, they philosophize. They without recourse to resources or printed materials, they become philosophers because they're philosophizing. And I think that's a good preparation later to become practitioners. So, I mean, I think you're on a very interesting track, but it remains to be seen how we can resolve some of the tensions that you've brought up. Thank you so much for this. It's a wonderful presentation. Okay, so go ahead. Patricia, is your hand up? Please keep the questions brief so we can get a few in before the break. Go ahead, unmute yourself, Patricia.
Okay. Can you hear me?
Yes.
Yes, yes.
Okay, thanks a lot, AV. I really appreciate your presentation. I found it very useful for us as practitioner or as teachers or professor or adults with young people. I really find it very interesting. And I can, if I'm correctly understood, I see the essence of your presentation in the concept of fluid and dialogic and unpredictable dialogue between we and our interlocutors. Is that correct? I mean, it's and
Yes.
you mentioned Marinoff and Rab and Schuster in this arena of pioneers in philosophical counselor. I would add also Habermas and also Achenbach, because Achenbach with the concept of no method. And during an APPA recent Agora, we really discussed about this, if in the meanwhile, maybe in so many years of practice, he has changed his mind, but no, he stayed on the concept of no method. Because this that you mentioned in the end, this informed ignorance, this openness to what can happen during a dialogue with our client, it's unpredictable, and this is very important because we don't stuck to any fixed or predetermined method. We just grow and learn through the dialogue. And the dualism that you put at the beginning, like I, it, which of course you neglect to pass to I, you, or I would say I, we, I, we, or I, us. So it's more plural, it's more community. So passing from Hannah Arendt to Simone Weil or to Habermas, a collective voice, because in that way we philosopher can be more influencing, more. We can leave a sign into our communities if we get out from the dualism. Even IU, it's a double kind of, but we have to open ourselves to the community. In a sense, it's a more political role of the philosopher. If we leave the IU, which is an advance, of course, between I and it as the client, totally detached from us as the counselor. But the it means that we are part of a bigger, larger community. But I really appreciate, and even the Michel Foucault quotation, then that's very important. I think it's a good understanding of Foucault, like what is critique or what is truth and what is the ethical role of a philosopher, which resembles the first presentation by Ang Lee, which I appreciate a lot indeed. So thanks a lot anyway.
Thank you. I wanted to tell about this point that, in fact, in the written article, I have explored a little bit about Aschenbach's. By treating the traditions as open instruments, we try to facilitate promoting the client to explain themselves rather than defaulting to, the urge to impose rigid theoretical explanations onto the speaker. So to do this in the batch two, we just directly took there were three papers. Paper one, paper two was academic philosophy, and this was introduced as a vocational skill-based course, the philosophical practice. So we just took those texts and explored them completely differently, not as a textbook-based learning course. We, in fact, I took the liberty to make two of the mythological figures, Arjuna and Bhartrihari, who are agents in different kinds of crisis, sit and treating text as taking it away from I-it paradigm to
Yeah.
IU paradigm, treating text as living this thing. Everything failed. Hmm? So that's why we had to come to this level. So that is the banking concept of education. They are
It's
heavily
very interesting.
deposited. Yeah.
Very interesting concept.
Okay,
Yeah.
thank
Thanks a
you.
lot.
Thank you
Thank
very
you.
much for the question and answer. John H is in the house with an electronic hand. Go ahead, John. Please unmute yourself.
Yes, thank you for that very illuminating presentation on the bringing a more progressive view of education through the teaching of philosophical practice. But one technical, well, it's a semantic question. When I studied Martin Buber a long time ago, his book was translated as I and Thou, and I guess Thou is now considered an archaic term, and it's has religious overtones, and it's maybe not the rest. So, but the you, for me, it leaves a little bit to be desired, because the idea is that there's an element of intimacy, heart to heart, as opposed to a formal business type of encounter. And I just wanted to raise that question: is the talking about IU as opposed to I-it might be expanded a little bit with some explanation of what is meant by Martin Buber in the original. Was it Ich und Du?
Yeah, of course. See, I was recently introduced to Martin Buber, so I'm still trying to understand what is the exact point about that. I could compare it with my own background knowledge about Indian philosophy, where Adi Shankara talks about adhyasa. There is something called adhyasa, where he argues that there cannot be any I you cannot exist. There is no subjectivity which is possible. So he shows a lot of contradiction in this kind of thinking. So when I try to understand this I you and I it paradigm, so it appeared to me that the way we are developing our knowledge base, the way we perceive what is taught to us, or our education, so itself is stopping us from understanding the I you. So even the I, you, or I, though of Buber, I'm understanding as I, it only. So I still want to spend some time in really grasping the idea, and then I will definitely be able to, clearly explain your.
Oh, thank you. So give the man some time to digest Buber, John. He's working on it. But let me suggest something off the cuff and maybe slightly misguided. But I think about the Latin languages. We're back to pronouns at the end of the day. We can't escape them. So the thou to me is not so much biblical as personal. If we think about the French distinction between tu and vous, where tu is familiar and intimate, and vous is impersonal and formal. I think that the thou is more on the former side of a personal, more intimate kind of interaction. A way of addressing someone as thou would be a more personal way, and you would be a more impersonal way. Obviously, we want the personal, but that's only one possible interpretation, and I may stand to be corrected by other linguists in the house. All right. Now, would
Thank you
anyone
very much.
add a final question or comment before we take a break? We have time for one brief question and answer. Anyone in the chat room or otherwise? Let me see. No, someone else agrees.
I'll jump in.
Yes, I'm on who's
Hi,
speaking.
Nancy Matchett here in
Oh, hi,
Colorado.
Nancy. Welcome.
Hi, and thanks.
Early,
Nice to
it's
see
early
you.
in Colorado, isn't it? Okay, go ahead.
It's not that early for me. I'm a farm girl.
Okay.
So, and I know we're running out of time in this session. I really appreciate this paper in part because I've been thinking, I've recently returned to classroom teaching after a 6-year hiatus, and I've been thinking a lot about the trajectory of the assessment movement and how it increasingly is shaping students how students understand education generally. And I think in bad ways. So I'm just wondering, AV, if you have thought about how rubric assessment and like all these questions that you're raising here, how they apply to just education generally, and is there any reason why I couldn't sort of straightforwardly translate some of the moves in your talk to a critique of dominant assessment practices in classrooms, maybe particularly philosophy classrooms, but I also think literature classrooms and humanities classrooms more generally. So I don't know if you have any quick thoughts on that.
Yeah, my thoughts about this are there is, no shortage of the genuine and holistic ways of education, and even when it comes to assessment or all these things. So what I'm finding is the kind of institutionalized minds with which we universities and all these people are working, that it can be applicable, you understand? It can be applicable, like you are saying, to general education and all these things. But I find philosophical praxis particularly suitable for that, because that is the only way to do it. Otherwise it would be wrong. Or else it is, as you are saying, it applies to education in general, but the universities and the institutional mindsets are not going to take that up so easily. So that's the problem more than the applicability of the holistic idea you are saying.
Great, thanks.
Thank you very much, AV and Nancy and the others. So it's time for a coffee break. We're a little over time, but not critically. It's 13 minutes. That's in New York. That's plenty of time for coffee. Please stay connected and help yourselves. You can turn off your cameras and have a coffee or a tea or whatever you like. We're going
Just
to resume at 11 o'clock. AV, you have one more comment? Go ahead.
I just wanted to tell you that I will submit the written paper today. That would be fine. I'll email the written paper
Well, that would
submission.
be great. Yes, we'll be very pleased to have your official version for publication later. We have, of course, a publication queue now. Our journal is fortunate enough to have enough submissions. So, but I will very much look forward to reading the full text, and we
Thank
will
you.
certainly take care of it once you send it in. Okay, thanks everybody. Great debut. We'll return at 11 sharp with Vana and our next two speakers. So please stay tuned. In the meanwhile, take a short break. We resume at 11 sharp. Thanks again.